Hello everyone, and welcome to another video of the tech reviews. After so many delays, I finally got my package from DHL. And with the package, I got a motherboard, which I'm not allowed to show you right now, and two processors. You can take a guess what they are. And two more processors, which I will test in this review. So it's the 11th generation Rocket Lake i7 11700 and the i9 11900T, which is a 35-watt TDP version. I will post two separate reviews for these two as they're intended for different audience. In this review, we'll take a look at the i7 11700. I have reviewed an engineering sample i7 11700 before with the Dell system, but that engineering sample was only 1.8 GHz in frequency, and it is one stepping before retail. Today, however, we'll be looking at an actual 11700 CPU. It is technically still a sample, but it's a qualification sample or media review sample, which is usually sent out to media for reviews or to manufacturers for demo systems. 99% of times they're the same as the retail chip. I think the only exception I can think of was Sandy Bridge, but it was 10 years ago, so I couldn't remember what exactly was the difference, but it was a very tiny one. So I guess it's safe to say that what we're looking at today is what you'll be getting on the shelf for the i7 11700 from Intel. Enough said, let's take a look at the processor itself. Of course, this review is before the media embargo for Rocket Lake, so Intel will not share any detailed information with me on this. Even if I do know some, I cannot share it right now. But I will use public information and leaks online, and that pretty much tells all you need to know about this processor. First of all, here is a slide from Intel at CES 2021, and here are the key differences. So first, unlike Comet Lake, the core count for the flagship model for this generation has reduced from 10 cores, 20 threads to 8 cores and 16 threads. This is due to the addition of AVX512 and a change in architecture, but it brings higher IPC and better cache performance compared to Comet Lake. The second point is it supports DDR4 3200 memory, which is not a big deal for computer enthusiasts since you will be overclocking the memory anyways, but it matters for some pre-builds like Dell or HP systems, which does not give you the option for XMP or memory overclocking. And it also employs the new Intel Xe graphics architecture and supports AV1 decoding and HDMI 2.0B output. It has 32 EUs and performs much better than the last generation UHD 630. And it also adds support for PCIe 4.0 and provides 20 lanes instead of 16 lanes in the last generation, which means you can connect both your GPU and NVMe SSDs directly to the CPU at full speed. The new C590 chipsets it pairs with support USB 3.2 Gen 2x2, 20 gigabits per second, and X8 DMI bus, which doubles the speed of C490, and that will give more bandwidth to the high-speed IOs and PCH attached M.2 SSDs. So things looks pretty good on paper here, but would Intel actually deliver what they promised? Let's find out. First of all, for this generation, i7 and i9 will have identical cores and thread count, as well as cache speed and size. The only difference is that i9 supports turbo velocity boost. The i9 11900K actually has 100 MHz lower base clock than the i7 11700K, which is quite strange in terms of product positioning. For the CPU we're looking at today, it is a non-K version of the i7 11700. It has 2.5 GHz base and 4.9 boost clock, which is much higher than the sample I reviewed last time. So let's get started. So for the review today, we're using an Asus Maximus 13 Hero we reviewed in the last video. And for the memories, I'm using a pair of G.Skill Trident Z 3200 MHz CL14 memories with XMP profile. For storage, I'm using a Western Digital SN850 1TB PCIe 4.0 M.2 SSD. For video card, I'm using an MSI Gaming X Trill RTX 3080 with the default BIOS. And for comparison, I've included a Ryzen 7 5800X. It is using an Asus X570 TUF board with the same memories and SSDs under the same settings. The PBO is set to auto in BIOS. So let's start from CPU-C. In this test, thanks to the increase in frequency, the 11700 is achieving a much higher single-thread score compared to our 1.8 GHz engineering sample we reviewed last time. And it's about 14% increase than the i7-10700. It also managed to achieve about 3.5% higher score than the Ryzen 5800X. In multi-core testings, it scales quite well compared to single-core test. It is about 8% faster than the 10700, and it also beats the 5800X by a tiny bit. But please note, this is a non-K i7, and it will be priced in the upper $300 range, which is about $80 cheaper than the 5800X. So considering the price difference, the result looks pretty promising to me. And next is Cinebench R15 and R20. So for Cinebench R15, we tested both single-core, multi-core, as well as OpenGL with the iGPU. The 11700 performs about 17% faster in single-core, which is very close to what Intel claims. But it still lags behind the 5800X in both single and multi-core tests. However, the iGPU brings a very decent increase. It has about 30% increase in average FPS in OpenGL compared to Comet Lake. In Cinebench R20, it is about the same situation. It's about 10% slower than the 5800X in multi-core performance, and only about 2% slower in single-core. It also brings 2-digit IPC increase over the 10700, which again matches what Intel claimed. Next is the IDA64 memory and cache benchmark. As I mentioned a couple times in the previous reviews, Rocket Lake brings a decent increase in cache performance, and the test result confirms that. I did not include a 5800X as they have different architectures and the numbers should not be compared directly. But we'll just take a look at how much performance it increased compared to the last generation. For L1 cache, we're seeing more than double the performance in all copy, write, and read benchmarks. That contributes a lot to the IPC increase. And the bump in L2 cache is not as dramatic as the L1, but still quite impressive to me. We're seeing about 50% increase in speed on read and copy, and the write speed remains similar. In L3 cache test, the 11700 is actually a little slower than the 10700, but it remains relatively the same in write and copy, but just slower in read. The memory part is a little interesting. So it achieves higher copy and write scores, but lags behind in read. I was informed by a product manager of C590 boards that Intel has released a microcode patch to fix the problem. We have to wait till the motherboard manufacturers release a new BIOS update to see if that's going to fix the problem. Next will be 7-zip. To my surprise, 5800X performs really well here and outperforms the 11700 by a significant margin. However, compared to the 10700, the 11700 is also able to achieve about 10% increase in performance, which is decent for a TOC kind of product. But yeah, I know, Intel has been talking forever, and hopefully Alder Lake will be the next tick. The Y cruncher results are pretty confusing. 11700 is able to finish calculating 1 billion digits of pi in just 177 seconds, which is half of how long it takes for the 10700. And it's about 50% faster than the 5800X too. However, it lags behind the 5800X in the single-core benchmarks. Actually, it even lags behind 10700 on this. Y cruncher actually supports AVX512, which would give Rocket Lake a significant boost in performance. So the high multi-core score is easy to explain. However, for the single core, I guess for some reason, AVX512 wasn't properly utilized, which kind of explains why there's a significant drop in performance. I'm still looking into this problem, and I will update this review once I find anything out. In Blender, we render both the BMW and the Classroom. Again, the sample we have today is much faster than a 1.8 GHz sample we used last time, and it catches close to 50-100x in Blender. Next is V-Ray. I recorded the average frequency during the benchmark. The 11700 averages about 200 MHz lower than the 10700, but it still outperforms the 10700 by about 12%. However, it is still about 10% slower than a 50-100x. In Handbrake, we're transcoding a 1 minute and 31 seconds 4K video into H.264 1080p 30 FPS video. So it's a tie between a 5800X and the 11700. They're both about 30% faster than the 10700. So good job, Intel. Lastly, for the CPU part is Geekbench. So in Geekbench CPU test, the 11700 outperforms the 5800X in single-threaded testings by a tiny margin while being 30% faster than the 10700. It still lags behind the 5800X in multi-core testings by about 5%, while being 10% faster than the 10700. Next will be the GPU part. First, let's start with the iGPU. So Intel has finally pushed its Xe graphics to the desktop market. The GPU is called UHD 750 and has 32 executive units. I happen to have its great ancestor in my collection. So this is an early GPU prototype right before Larabi exists. You're getting old if you know what I'm talking about. So back to the topic. So we already did a benchmark of the iGPU with our last 1.8 GHz sample, but we're going to do it again with this sample we have with the latest Intel driver and see if that's going to bring any uplift in performance. So let's start from the compute benchmark. In Geekbench 5 compute test, it delivers very promising result. It is about 15% faster in Vulkan and about 20% faster in OpenCL. This is roughly GTX 650 Ti level of performance. I know, it doesn't sound very impressive, but considering its tiny size and ultra-low TDP, it is still a big step in iGPU. Not to say you get it for free anyways. Not very impressed? Let's move on. So next is the 3D Mark night rate. I guess anyone would call this impressive, because we're getting a 47% performance increase over the UHD 630 in the 10700. Again, Intel actually delivers what they promised this time. Okay, so next, let's try high performance with the RTX 3080. The GPU we're using today is the MSI Gaming X Trail. I'm using the default BIOS for all benchmarks. So firstly is the 3D Mark time spike. Please note, I use smaller scales in the chart just to show the difference. But if you actually compare some numbers, it is only about 8% slower than a 5800X, and it's 4% faster than the 10700. In Hitman 2, the result is similar to TimeSpy. Only 5800X is about 25% faster this time. Next is Horizon Zero Dawn. This is what they call a sightseeing kind of game. And things are a little different here. So the Ryzen 5800X and the 11700 performs on par, and they're both about 8% faster than the 10700. In Dirt 5, again, I changed the scale just to show you the difference, because I think it would be boring if they all look the same on the chart. But the actual difference is quite small. It is actually less than 5%. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider, 5800X also pulls ahead in FPS, but 11700 is about 10% faster in GPU FPS. However, that did not translate to the actual FPS, because the actual FPS is determined by the lowest of the three. So it is about 22 FPS less than the 5800X, but it's about 13 FPS faster than the 10700. Next, let's take a look at the Unigine tests. So first is the Unigine Superposition. We're using 1080p Extreme. All three CPUs perform very similar here. I figure Superposition is actually more sensitive to frequency rather than architecture. In Unigine Heaven, this trend continues. This is a rather old benchmark, so it's not very CPU intensive. All processors perform similar, and the difference is within 5%. In Unigine Valley, it actually shows some difference. So the 11700 Rocket Lake is about 10% faster than a Comet Lake. It also manages to beat 5800X, although only by 1%. So, conclusion. Did Intel deliver what they promised? The answer is a clear yes. But does that mean you should spend your hard-earned dollars and upgrade to a Rocket Lake right now? Well, it depends. So, if you're upgrading from a Z490, it's probably not worth it in my opinion. But if you're upgrading from something like Skylake or older, and you just want a good gaming PC, then I would say it's definitely worth the upgrade. Yes, I know Elder Lake is coming in a couple months, but the cost of the platform will be much higher because of DDR5 and the new power delivery requirements for the CPU. Not to say if it's really good, like the Ryzen 5000 series, most likely you won't be able to get them at MSRP anyways. So that's it for the i7-11700. Since it's actually a locked CPU, so overclocking, power consumptions, and temperature is really out of the question. I will look into more of these when I get the K version of the 11700. We'll have another video on the 35W i9 11900T version, so please stay tuned on that. Okay, that's it for today's video. If you liked the video, please hit the like button and subscribe. Thanks for watching.